app and main, which gives us our basic layout. We've styled the sidebar. So just continuing left to right, we have the list, right? NoteList. NoteList JS. NoteList CSS. Yeah, there it is. So NoteList right now just has this paragraph. So let's see if we can get something reasonable out of our static content. So here's the list. And what's hard-coded in here is an H3 and a UL with a bunch of LIs in it. We don't need all those hard-coded notes in there. But just to make sure that we have the basic layout right, we could put one of them. So I will copy from this starting div to the end of the first LI. And then I just need to be sure that I put my closing div tag in there. So my return statement inside my stateless functional component will need to have parentheses around it now. Let's fix our indentation because it makes it a lot easier to troubleshoot if we can tell what lines up with what. Don't forget my closing div tag. And of course, we have a bunch of classes in here. I saw in the release notes for the latest version of VS Code that actually controller command click does the multiple cursors thing. So maybe it was an extension that gave me that functionality with Alt. But control command lets me put in multiple cursors, which is really nice when you need to do things like this. Great, great feature. Now I've still got a problem. The UL, yep, since we only went to the end of the LI, my UL needs a closing tag as well, not just the div. Thanks. Save that and have a look at the layout. Okay, that doesn't look quite like we expected. We still need the CSS for the list, right? So NoteList CSS. We can pull that out of static CSS, look for the portion that applies to just the list. We will come up with this portion. So everything that's prefaced with .NoteList, and then everything down to the end of the last rule that has to do with the UL. So probably this all should have been prefaced with like NoteList space this, but it wasn't. I'm not necessarily going to mess with that right now, but if we were writing this style sheet from scratch, we would probably do that. Just make sure we scope these things correctly. So the idea is we don't want anything in this style sheet to apply to things that are not in this component. And there are ways of doing that in React, but they're a little on the advanced side. So just so you know, importing these style sheets in this component, it doesn't stop these styles from applying to other components. It's really just for the sake of organizing our code and making sure that, you know, since this component definitely needs it, if we were to copy this component somewhere else, we would have that same import statement. And it would remind us that the style sheet needs to go with it. So that's that rule, or set of rules. And now it looks much nicer. Anything particularly interesting here? We do have one responsive design rule, a media query that I know Seth mentioned very briefly yesterday, what these do. So that just means the rules that appear inside these curly braces apply only if the width of the window is less than 800 pixels. So if that's the case, we change the width from 30 rem to 20 rem, which we happen to know is 300 pixels versus 200 pixels because our rim size is 10. But if we make this smaller and smaller, we'll see at that breakpoint, it takes up a smaller portion of the page so that it leaves enough room for the form. We use this calc trick that we used temporarily on the last project to make sure that the notes list takes up something like the entire height, but it needs to leave room for this portion up here. And the reason we have to set an explicit height is because of an overflow rule that we have somewhere. Overflow hidden, that way it'll scroll. Or that's well, no, that's on the LI, sorry. Overflow Y scroll right here. So by setting a maximum height, it'll keep it so that the whole page doesn't necessarily scroll, but the note list will. If you look at the final version, well, this isn't enough to scroll. But if we looked at the completed version, and we'll see this later, the list of notes will scroll independently of the whole page. We use this same transition trick on hovering on a note to change the background color. They're not images this time. It's just the background color, but we have that same ease in, ease out effect. We use a trick that we used on Jeffervescence to make sure that there's no border on the very first note on top, but there is on everything else. Otherwise, we would get an extra thick border on the top. Text decoration none. The point of this is links by default are underlined. And that's going to give us an effect that we don't want sooner or later. So I have a rule in there for that. Instead of getting rid of the border when I hover, I make it transparent so that the blue covers the border, basically, is the point. Nothing else too terribly interesting on this one. So that's the style for NoteList, and we have a hard-coded note in there. So add some static content and style to NoteList.